explain the reason why I decided to offer this topic to the Institute, and it's fantastic to have this continuous relationship with AAA Victoria that I have enjoyed in partnership with the Institute over many, many years. I just want to make a disclaimer because I'm here to represent Curtin Korea Research and Engagement Center. What I'm going to share with you is part of our ongoing research activity, which has been supported by the Korea University Program for Korean Studies through the Ministry of Education of the Republic of Korea, and we certainly want to acknowledge their generous support with regards to programs that we undertake as part of our profile of looking at the Korean Peninsula and issues associated with Korea's and the neighborhood. The reason why I offered to Alexey to speak on Russia-DPRK relationship is because this month in particular will be quite interesting, even though it hasn't really been reflected in the news. First of all, Russia's current president, Vladimir Putin, will be sworn into office after a very surprising and unexpected win at most recent presidential elections. But that's obviously not the core of the story. It has been speculated that this month will also see his first overseas trip, which he will do in his all-new capacity as Russia's head of state. And formally, it's been announced that Putin will travel to Beijing, which would be his first point of contact. However, there is a speculation that on the way to Beijing, Vladimir Putin might actually have a quick stopover in Pyongyang, whether it would be before or whether it would be after. But there is an open invitation that he received last year from his North Korean counterpart. So that's what I thought that to bring this topic to you tonight as a preempt to what may become a major international news, because it's not about if, but when Russian head of state will travel to North Korea, it would certainly hit international news quite significantly. And even if we look at the situation from the geopolitical perspective, the fact that the Russians entertain, or the Kremlin entertains, the possibility of effectively meeting two targets in one trip is a reflection of the circumstances where the three countries find themselves adjoined. Russia shares border with North Korea, which obviously makes it a natural player in regional affairs, the affairs of DPRK as well as on the Korean Peninsula, but also brings China into the equation one way or another. And this is not a recent affair. This is something that's been going on for quite some time. I mean, this year is going to mark several milestones, historical milestones, and quite a few of them are affiliated with our part of the world. The first milestone I just want to remind you of is 120 years since the first major war in Asia, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. So this year marks 120 years since it started. And what it's to do with Korea? Well, part of the fighting that was going on between the Russian and the Japanese empires was for the control of Korea. In fact, a well-known historical fact of the battle near Chemulpo, which is at that time was a small Korean settlement where Russian cruiser the Varyak was engaged by the Japanese squadron. And that just was probably a symbol of one of the symbols of that particular engagement. But more broadly, it was also a reflection of the power struggle over the control over Korea. Something that was renewed in the final year of the war in the Pacific and World War II, when the Soviet Union joined the Allies and launched a strategic offensive in Manchuria. One of the advances that the Soviets made against the Japanese in continental part of Northeast Asia was on Korea, where they effectively took control over what's currently known as North Korea, and then there was a decision to split zones of occupation along the 38th parallel, which obviously gave birth to what we currently know as DPRK, as well as the Republic of Korea. Another time when, and obviously because of the Soviet Union, at that time largely, North Korea emerged as a standalone nation. Massive economic, political, military, cultural aid went towards Pyongyang in building up its capability, which also led to the first major conflict that occurred just 5 years after the end of the last World War, and I'm referring to the war in Korea, where the Soviet Union played a very important, if not, I wouldn't say pivotal role, but certainly he was one of the game changers. It was one of the game changers in the conflict, which also demonstrated the level of Moscow's intimate involvement in Korean strategic affairs, but also a new game that was played because of the advent of nuclear weapons, of the new balancing situation between Washington on one hand and its allies, Moscow on the other hand, and its growing network of clients and allies. But I think when we talk about the Korean War, we spend a lot of time discussing China's involvement, but I don't think we discuss enough and understand enough the level of Soviet covert involvement in the war. One can debate whether Stalin approved the invasion or not. From what I understand, there was a conditional approval subject that it would be a quick, a short and victorious war. But when things started looking pear-shaped for the North, especially after the United States exercised strategic amphibious operation near Incheon, and North Korea was on the brink of collapse and military as well as strategic defeat. Stalin and Mao agreed to act in concert, and that was actually the first time when the two countries joined forces on the battlefield. The Chinese supplied some 300,000 so-called volunteers that crossed the border, and the Soviets provided military technological backup, which was most evidently represented in the air power component, because Stalin feared that a massive aerial bombardment of North Korea may be a prelude for a subsequent aerial strike against the Soviet Union. So the Soviets sent in their fighter pilots who pretended to be Chinese, but when it came to actual dogfight situations in the air, their basic and very rudimental understanding of Mandarin was effectively washed down the drain. Everyone switched to their home language. It was intercepted and picked up by the Americans and other allied forces, and it became a known secret that the Soviets were fighting en masse on the Korean side, but at the same time it was kept quiet because no one wanted the escalation of the situation to escalate to the next phase when you have to make strategic decision and declare war on the Soviet Union, and in the situation of a mounting Cold War confrontation that would probably escalate to an open nuclear confrontation. But the extent of the Soviet involvement there, and there are debates, who won the skies over Korea. Both sides, the Americans and the Russians, kind of present their own figures, is profound if we just look at the official stats that says over 64,000 sorties were performed by the Soviet pilots, but all up to 70,000 Soviet military personnel took part in the Korean War. That was the single largest contingent that the Soviets have committed before the invasion of Afghanistan. and since the end of the Second World War. So Korea featured, was the first battlefield, the first proxy battlefield of the Cold War, but Korea featured quite prominently in the Soviet strategic calculus, which was also manifested down the track when the Cold War situation evolved, including the 1968 Puebla incident. For those who are not familiar, the US intelligence gatherer, USS Puebla stage mission in the vicinity of Korea was intercepted by the Korean military. They boarded the ship, took crew prisoner, escorted it to their home port. Eventually, the crew was released, but Puebla still sits in North Korea as a museum display. But why it's got to do with the Soviets? Obviously, besides they having access to codes and classified equipment on board, there was a standoff between the Soviet Navy and the United States Navy, because the United States Navy sent its battle group to liberate the ship, and the Soviets deployed their naval force that began shadowing operations of the United States task force, which prevented the Americans from claiming back USS Puebla. So it was a manifestation on what the Soviet Union would do in the protection of its junior partner, its junior brother. Throughout the Cold War, Pyongyang continued to receive generous economic and certainly military support. Soviet warships hauled on North Korean ports. There were contingencies in place also because the Soviets looked at not just the survivability of the North Korean regime, but more importantly, at the US security and defense relationship with the RRK. Every time, and I remember from my old days in my previous life, every time the Americans and the South Koreans ran exercise Team Spirit, everyone in the Soviet Far East and in North Korea just went on a high alert, because it was always considered to be a potential precursor for something a bit more serious and sinister. But it all came to an end with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with Russia's strategic transformation, decommunization of Russia, and by that, the abandonment of old Soviet ties. And North Korea was one of the first regimes that the new Russian government dropped, partially because ideologically it became very difficult to talk to North Koreans, especially with their very particular version of events and even their own unique calendar. But also because obviously Russia was developing strategic relationship with the West, and it wanted to position itself as a constructive partner rather than a partner that contributed to situations similar to 1968. So the period of the post-Cold War, and I've purposefully chosen the kind of the darkish color, it's not to reflect that things were looking gloom for the world. It began looking gloom for Pyongyang, because all of a sudden Pyongyang found itself deprived of what was an unconditional credit line coming from the Soviets. Not to say, and obviously I want to make it quite clear, that Moscow was not the sole provider of assistance to the North Koreans. This is also was the time when North Korea developed quite robust relationship with the PRC, and at the time when the Soviets and the Chinese were locked in mortal combat, ideological and to some extent military strategic combat, Pyongyang found itself maneuvering in between, and because of the unique kind of perceptions on things, unique calendar and unique of everything, they managed kind of to benefit from being part of that strategic tripod, which I referred to you in one of my opening slides. But things began looking different. The Russians couldn't obviously help to recognize that whether they liked the North Korean regime, I'm talking about Russia under Yeltsin and Russia under Putin version 1.0, not current Putin. They are neighbors. Russia shares border with North Korea. So one way or another, whatever is happening to the south of Russia's border with North Korea will affect Russia's Far East. And depending on how serious things can get, it may have further effects. So regional security considerations has always been part of Russia's strategic agenda. And as well as even with the sort of expectation that Russia will now be part of the Western family, it's a member of Western civilization. There was still a lot of resentment in Moscow from the neocons, from those who had sort of a healthy allergy towards a relationship with the West because of the Cold War warrior mentality. So they continue to look at North Korea as a buffer, as a safety zone between the RRK, Japan, and the United States, and obviously factoring in a US contingent that continued to be stationed in South Korea, and looked at North Korea as a form of a barrier and a buffer. There were kind of interests economically, but because Korea came firmly under sanctions, especially when it took the path towards indigenous nuclear capability and missile development, Russian businesses took a chill pill and were very cautious in terms of showing any interest in Korea because they didn't want to be affected by sanctions. And we're talking about the period of 1990s or early 2000s when Russia was not part of the sanctions regime apart from a couple of leftovers from the Cold War. Also, the regime's behavior in North Korea, every time North Korea decided to fire something into the maritime domain, as far as I know, Russian systems always went on alert because before the North Koreans began perfecting their guidance systems, the guess of where this missile would land, whether it would be Japan's exclusive economic zone or mainland or island, or it would be in Russia's exclusive economic zone, and a couple of times there were actually landings there. Anyone's guess. Plus, the Russians would obviously have the knee-jerk reaction because they didn't know how the South would react to whatever North was trying to impress, etc. Plus, the rhetoric that was coming from Kim's family was not helpful in any way. And whilst Russia remained part of the six-party talks and still is part of six-party talks, which is important to reflect. The expectation that Moscow retained some special links, which it did with North Korea, North Korea's regime, and I'll speak more about this later on, didn't really make the Russians feel more comfortable, even though they could probably have more frank discussions with North Koreans than the Chinese, something I want to flag as well. So Russia was also concerned about its image as a newly discovered responsible international player. At least this is how the Russians felt in the 90s and 2000s. So for them, not pushing away the North Korean friend was considered to be part of their responsible behavior and the demonstration that Russia has changed. Oops, I was too fast. One of the reflections on how low the relationship went from shielding North Koreans from the United States Navy back in the 60s down to the situation in the 1990s, and even right through the first decade of the 21st century. Even though Russia is technically North Korea's second largest trading partner, the amount of annual trade that the two countries enjoyed could probably be compared to the worst years of Russia-Australia trade relations, when our trade with Russia was actually lower than our trade, say, with Brazil. However, that was all before COVID. When COVID hit, the trade went down almost to ground zero. So it wasn't even in the three-digit figures. It was reduced down to almost two-digit figures. So the economic element was almost non-existent. And obviously, it looked disproportionate to the economic element that dominated and continued to dominate North Korea's relations with the PRC. However, Even though Russia joined the sanctions regime and imposed sanctions on North Korea, the last round was imposed in 2017. And in fact, I gave a presentation here back in 2018. I found that slide from presentation back then. And that was the last time Putin was showing good faith towards supporting the international effort to contain North Korea in its adventurism in the region. And here is the listing of why the Russians did it. Also by finding out firsthand that North Korea was trading and exporting its conventional capability to different funny elements. And when the Russians, for example, intercepted some shorter portable surface-to-air missiles in the hands of the so-called Syrian opposition, which used them in an attempt to down Russian aircraft after the Russians began running the Syria campaign, well, the Russians kind of turned to North Korea and simply saying, what the hell? You know, how do you explain this? So here came sanctions that Putin signed in October 2017, and that was probably the last time Russia showed its back towards North Korea. Then came COVID, and COVID became like a natural barrier in what was supposed to be a gradual reanimation of strategic ties. So from 2018, effectively a year later, after Russia signed the sanctions regime, the conversations between the Russians and the North Koreans began picking up on more of a quiet side of things. Even, you can still hear me? Okay. Even the Russian media on occasionally reported, and I think it was done purposefully, that chief of Russia's foreign intelligence would travel to North Korea to stage discussions there, etc. And obviously, as you can appreciate, normally chiefs of any intelligence do not report or where they're on their itinerary or their business engagement. So I think the Russians began, by releasing that information, the Russians began sending signals saying, well, we're getting into the intimate conversations with North Koreans. We're not going to necessarily tell you what they're about. On one hand, we're still upholding the regime, but on the other hand, we are not going to be unconditional friends and be transparent about what we do. There was supposed to be a conversation occurring between Russian and North Korean militaries at the very senior level, but because of COVID and when North Korea went into complete lockdown, that sort of activity was postponed. And the reason why I'm saying all of this is because that helped to explain what happened between the two countries of the past 2 years. The common and the question that I put in as a form of in my title, you know, are we talking about brotherhood in arms, something that once again North Korea remembered since the Korean War and throughout the Cold War, or is it something that is mutually beneficial to the two autocratic regimes, or one autocratic, one real kind of, you know, classical dictatorship? Obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent protraction of the hostilities and the speculation that Russia was running out of ammo and other things began sort of floating ideas that there's going to be a growing interaction occurring with a number of so-called rogue regimes, and one of them was North Korea. In this sense, and I was quite interested to come across this statistics of whom Kim writes letters to when he feels particularly lonely. And what was quite interesting is the level of correspondence between him and Vladimir Putin. If you look in particular at the year that last year and this year, obviously from Kim's perspective, Putin cannot compete with Bashar al-Assad of Syria. Obviously, he's number one, his pen friend. And so are the men pets that went to Syria, to whoever. But after Bashar al-Assad, Putin comes effectively second. Well, there is Laos there that featuring quite strongly this year. But for example, compared to the trend with the Chinese, it's sort of, you know, sometimes it's going higher, sometimes it's lower compared to to Russia, but certainly there's been an increase of communications between Kim and Putin since the start of the year. And again, this is only something that open source discloses. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be a different level of cables or other messages that are exchanged between Moscow and Pyongyang on different levels. Well, that would be interesting, and somehow this research doesn't really. Maybe that would be released in December. You know, once it would be clear who is in the White House, because it's not part of my research. It's something that I actually came across, but I found it quite entertaining. If you want to look more, just Google NK News from 4th of April this year. But certainly there's been a sort of an increase in the correspondence, but also an increase in face-to-face communication. So from 2020, well, from late 2022, speculation rose that North Korea began demonstrating willingness to supply the Russian military with munitions and perhaps some armaments which would be compatible to the systems used in the Russian arsenal, given the fact that North Korean arsenal is heavily influenced by Russian military school of design and construction of or manufacturing of weapon systems. Also because North Korea, after Russia invaded Ukraine, was one of the few countries that actually came out with a clear message of support. In this sense, North Korea competed with Myanmar, both of them openly sidelined with the Russians, and not so much because they had a quarrel with the Ukrainians, but they looked at it through the prism of Russia's confrontation with the United States. So Kim openly told that he is on the side of Putin, even though Putin 7 years earlier felt very grumpy with Kim. There was a reference to VD15, in case you were wondering what it was. It was Victory Day 2015, anniversary of Russia's celebrations of the victorious end in the Second World War. Kim was invited to that after meeting with Putin, but he declined, and the Russians took it as an offense. So 2 years later, Putin signs yet another restriction on North Korea. No, I'm not saying that Putin took it personally, but on the other hand, you know, no one can say nothing about that. So there was a quite an interesting turnaround, and I would, in this sense, would be curious to know if Kim will actually visit Moscow next year, when Russia will mark yet another anniversary of victory over Nazism, and that would demonstrate how far the relations have actually progressed. But after the initial open statement saying North Korea will continue to fight along the Russians against the American imperialists and every other form of imperialism they could identify, the Russians began really massaging them, which resulted in a visit to Pyongyang by the Russian foreign minister. The visit, again, wasn't a result of Russia's desperate, according to our perception, attempts to find additional sources of staging the campaign. The visit was actually in the planning phase before COVID hit. Shoigu, Russia's current defense minister, was supposed to be in Pyongyang around 2020 or 2021. So that was a result of the conversation that began taking place from 2018. So what I was trying to identify here, there was actually a pattern developing. So it's not something ad hocish or something desperate. But the level of reception Shoigu received in Pyongyang was second to none. Even I was amazed, and it's really difficult to amaze me. Speaking even, given one example, over there you see him sitting next to Kim at the concert, North Korea's concert, the army concert. But what really amazed me that there was a segment of the concert where North Koreans sang Russian songs in Russian. They also did it for the Chinese, but they made more emphasis on singing Russian songs, including the ones that would have references to God. and something that North Korean ideology would probably not comprehend under other circumstances. But clearly, they went out of their way to demonstrate that they remember, they cherish the relationship, and they want to make it special. There was also a display of Korea's military hardware. Kim took Shoigu personally, showing all the phallic symbols he can come across. And there was a lot of speculation as a result of that, suggesting that, well, this is what Russia may be getting and would start deploying in Ukraine. A couple of months later, that happened in July, in mid-September, Kim decided that his choo-choo armored train was rusting for too long. So he took it all the way to the Far East, where he spent a week, and I call it Kim's Toys Tour, because he effectively looked at every single military toy he could get his hands on. And the Russians gave him a smorgasbord, starting with Russia Space Launch Facility, explaining to Kim what can go into space in terms of boosters, in terms of satellites. Then he was taken to Russia's aircraft manufacturing plant, was given access to Russia's 5th generation fighter, and that's the first time that I actually saw a foreign national given access to that platform. Then he traveled to Vladivostok, where he first of all saw a line of Russian strategic bombers. Obviously, for him, anything that is big obviously makes an impression. Then he toured the Russian Pacific Fleet. No agreements were signed. There were no public confirmations that any agreements were signed either during the July visit of Shoigu to Pyongyang or during Kim's visit and his meeting with Putin at the spaceport in September. But after that, we began seeing more reports, including photographic satellite imagery of train convoys, of shipments by sea, of stuff that North Korea began sending to Russia. And obviously, during that time, Kim extended his personal invitation to Putin, initially via his defense minister in July. Then he reinstated, and Putin said yes, he would agree. And in fact, there was a speculation that Kim would actually get Russian-made Lima that was designed for Putin as Russia's head of state. And apparently, he's getting an upgraded version for his inauguration this year. Huh? Yeah, sorry, it was 2023. I was so keen to meet you, so I put it this year. So yeah, it was in September 2023. So Kim may get his personal toy in the sense of armored protected car, but there was also speculation that Kim wanted access to Russia's technology and Russia was apparently willing to entertain this as a form of defiance, also in exchange for whatever the Russians began receiving from North Korea, which is munition and perhaps some capabilities, strike capabilities. So what does it all mean for Northeast Asia? So if one of the intrigues behind Putin's apparent forthcoming visit to North Korea, whether that would eventuate in a signing of some sort of a treaty to kind of materialize this renewed relationship. And by that, we can then start talking about whether it's the brotherhood of arms or they just, friends with benefits, being in the de facto relationship without necessarily declaring unconditional allegiance to one another. But one way or another, and this is the satellite imagery, open source satellite imagery that was released gradually. This goes back to about November last year. Of what it means, obviously, we need to remember that we're talking about a renewed relationship between two nuclear armed nations that are neighbors, and that obviously shape up and have an effect on Northeast Asian security environment. If this relationship will continue to progress, which may result in DPRK offering military technologies to Russia in support of Russia's war effort in Ukraine. And that's quite interesting because at some point in time, it starts looking like both Koreas are now engaged in a different form of twisted proxy war that is currently being fought in Ukraine, because South Korea has been beefing up Poland's military capabilities, and there's been a discussion that South Korea has been asked to provide munitions to Ukraine because Ukraine now operates Western systems. And I think when that kind of discussion took place, there was even more renewed symbolism coming out of Pyongyang. So even if North Korea will accelerate whatever it supplies to Russia, it may also be an act of defiance in response to whatever Seoul is doing there. So it's kind of getting really complicated and messy, but also highly speculative. So I'm just putting it out as a speculation rather than as a proven fact. There was a conversation about Russia getting again port access, which would increase the reach for the Russian Pacific Fleet, something that it enjoyed during the times of the Cold War, and will certainly not make tensions on the Korean Peninsula easy. There was a conversation about joint exercise, and in fact, Russia's defense minister proposed trilateral defense exercise involving North Korea, PRC, and Russia operating jointly in the maritime domain, which would also be quite interesting. Nothing has come out. There was no, I think, formal commentary on this coming from Beijing, so it can be interpreted either way, but not to say that Russia and North Korea cannot do bilateral exercises, which I think are on the cards. But it's not that all of a sudden Beijing fits into Moscow. Whatever North Korea is supplying, and I suspect that's artillery munitions, perhaps some drone technology, because North Korea was cloning in some of the capabilities they managed to get their hands on, perhaps some tactical missiles. Russia will provide North Korea with economic support. And this is where I want to also to draw attention to the last line here, because I won't be surprised at all if Russia will start lifting sanctions. Not all, but some of the sanctions on North Korea, because even the tone of Russian diplomats who sit at the round table in UN headquarters as permanent members of the UN Security Council has changed profoundly. Whatever North Korea does, Russia is the first to come to its defense, effectively justifying actions of Pyongyang, explaining it. It's all about self-defense. It's all about sovereign right, etc., etc. There is not a single word of condemnation coming from Moscow anymore, at least the one that I have picked up and collected. The fact that Kim tried all the toys, at least he was given a window tour of all the toys, suggests that North Korea still wants access to some of Russia's sensitive technologies. And that may be on the cards as well, ranging from Russia assisting North Korea to launch something into space. There was a speculation that there may be some sharing of submarine technologies. Again, turning North Korea into a proxy in the balancing game against South Korea, Japan, the United States, and also bearing in mind the AUKUS framework, which the Russians are getting more and more concerned about. But again, I don't want to create an impression that it's unconditional love, because I can still sense that there is still a bit of reservation in Moscow about North Korea. I don't think Moscow either that is so desperate to simply jump into bed with North Koreans without thinking of potential consequences, or is so naive to pretend that everything the Russians were concerned about, even in the final years of the Cold War, is no longer there. So the Russians would continue to be taken into account the shared frontier. They would take into account that any outbreak of major conflict on the Korean Peninsula would inevitably have an impact on Russia, whether it's environmental, whether it's because of the excesses of of refugees, and I'm sure that it would flow across the border if North Korea would say come under sustained attack. And the fact that what the Russians wanted all the time since effectively the Korean War, removal of the buffer. They lost the buffer in Eastern Europe. For them, losing buffer in Northeast Asia is something that they cannot afford. So on one hand, acts as a pull factor for them to get more into the supportive of regime stability in North Korea. But at the same time, they're also mindful that North Korean regime is as predictable as, I don't want to offend the locals, referring to your local weather, but as predictable as other things that, you know, really hard to get. Look, I mean, I come from Perth. We just had 4 months of never-ending skies. Only had like rain over the past 2 days. So for us, it's predictably boring weather-wise. So whatever North Korea does, because it's only 100 km from Vladivostok, makes the Russians feel nervous even now. But what it makes them feel more nervous is what the United States, South Korea, Japan, and its allies are doing initially with regards to North Korea's behavior. So whatever they are doing as a form of deterrence, including deployment of ballistic missile elements, inevitably affects Russia's security, just like it affects Chinese security. So by default, North Korea, one way or another, has negative effect on Russian security. And at the same time, Moscow still leaves a small window of opportunity, something that they exploited throughout the 1990s by simply saying, we have trust relationship because Kim's family trusts the Russians more than they trust the Chinese. Kim's family had historical affection towards the Russia, towards the Soviets and the Russians continue to exploit this in terms of having frank conversations, etc. And I think there are still indicators that the Russians send as members of the six-party talks that we still have this channel that perhaps Beijing doesn't, even though North Korea is overwhelmingly dependent on that. So I'm not going to give you a clear answer because it's still a bit of an ambiguous, but certainly watch this month or certainly watch this year, because once Putin will land in Pyongyang, I think something cute will come out of that. Thank you.
Alexey, thank you very much. And the usual excellent slide presentation. Thank you again for putting all the work into that. So, you know, you heard it here first if Putin goes there. So we're happy to take questions. There's a roving mic, so please just state your name and please a brief question. So we'll go to David first and then Riley.
David, member of the Institute. A very simple question. In your slide, Kim's toys, there is a red-headed person. What is that all about?
Red-headed person. Let me just take back to the slides. Which one?
Excuse me, go back one more. No, one more.
No.
Sorry. In one of your slides, there is a red-headed person.
Maybe it's a light reflection or something like that. I couldn't remember. It didn't certainly strike my view that there was a red-headed.
What I'm getting at is, does Kim have foreign people in his advisory group?
You mean not North Koreans?
Correct.
Your guess was probably as good as mine. Okay, let me put it this way. There is a Russian embassy in Pyongyang. If he wants advice, he can get it there.
Very strange that if he does have a foreigner in his advisory group, the red head would be.
Maybe we'll take that an advisement and we'll check after.
Look, I mean, the only other thing, again, I don't want to speculate because you know, I prefer to be driven by facts. Knowing how much Kim distrusts anyone and know how paranoid his security entourage is, I just cannot possibly imagine having someone who is a foreigner in his inner circle. That's why I'm referring to
Bottom left, bottom right corner, in the background.
him.
Then,
That's the interpreter. The interpreter. But that's actually happening in Vladivostok. So he's an escort person, I'm sure, with a rank, who will communicate between him and chief of the Russian Pacific Fleet.
Right.
Thank you, Alexey, for a wonderful talk. There's been a bit of chatter coming out of North Korean scholars, from what I can understand, about the strategic environment now for the Kim, but particularly also just North Korea over the last 30 years. It's the best that it's ever been for there to be any kind of action against the South. They're perceiving the 2017 Trump talks as a breaking down. There's a lot more discussion around placing the economy in a more of a war footing. It seems unlikely that there's going to be some massive strategic change, but potentially the options for southern, denazification or something along those lines, some kind of more sort of escalation of tensions between the North and the South, as the discussions of unity seem to keep coming back to the fore, and the changes in the North Korean war economy settings. What do you make of that particular chatter per se?
Look, first of all, I need to say I'm not North Korean expert. I know people who are real Korea experts who also travel to North Korea. I'm looking at it from the viewpoint of Russia's strategic engagement. So that's as far as my interaction is concerned. The only other thing I can only offer you is understanding what North Koreans fielded in their arsenals. I think the window of opportunity to do something nasty to North Korea, if not gone completely, but is really, really narrow, because you sort of talking about using potential, not you, but if there is any possible entertainment of a potential coercive action against the country that clearly states that we will operationalize our nuclear weapons capability every available opportunity. And this is not going to be a speculation whether Russia will nuke Ukraine or not. They'll simply go and do it. Makes the war effort incredibly costly. The North Koreans did not just show incredible survival under the sanctions at the cost of their own people, but they're progressively introducing systems that I'm really surprised that they actually have in terms of mimicking or something like that. So I won't be suggesting that. I could understand this that sort of issue when North Korea was back in the 1990s. It was abandoned by the Russians. The Chinese didn't have much of an interest in a level-on commitment beyond just economic help. And yes, then they would just, their defense was very much driven by how many bodies they are willing to sacrifice. These days, it's bodies plus some capabilities, which would make any attempt to overrun them incredibly costly. So, and coming back to what I was saying, now the Russians seem to be even more interested to ensure that the regime survives, because Russia wants predictability on its border with North Korea, just like many, and that may be surprising and not pleasant to us, wanted Putin to remain in office, because that kind of gives a global South an understanding of Russia's predictability under him. So in this sense, kind of Putin applies the same logic towards Kim. I don't know if it answers your question.
Thank you. Zara Kimpton. Alexey, can you just comment a bit more about how this is all going down, or going to go down if Putin does visit, in Seoul and Tokyo? Because the flyers talk about the US wanting to increase its security arrangements with Tokyo and Seoul. But do you think that those two countries are both concerned about the rapprochement between Russia and North Korea?
Well, the two countries, Japan is even more concerned about Russia's strategic rapprochement with China. And this is something that has also been reflected in the Japanese white paper, I think for the first time last year or a couple of years back. But again, because we continue to be in this ambiguous stage, that's why I put this in the title, we don't know what it would become. But if there's going to be confirmation that this is something that is becoming a trend rather than an ad hoc kind of affair, then obviously Japan will join South Korea. I mean, South Korea would be concerned. South Korea is concerned about anything that's happening to the north of the 38th parallel. Plus, they had quite unpleasant conversations with the Russians because the Russians had been warning them not to provide any assistance to the Ukrainians or to the Poles. Obviously, South Korea considered this intervention in their domestic affairs. But the Russians effectively gave them a warning saying, you'll pay the price. And it's not through the introduction of counter sanctions because both South Korea and Japan joined the sanctions regime. But I think the Russians would use North Korea as a bargaining chip. For Japan, it would also be a confirmation of Russia's manifestation that you can kiss your northern territories goodbye. So the Russians are closing on this matter permanently. If before they were willing to entertain, even as a remote possibility, an idea of jointly sharing some of the islands, now they're saying, that's it, we don't care anymore. So it's symbolically, and again, I'm trying to draw the difference between symbolism and realpolitik. So the Russians are very symbolic about playing realpolitik with North Korea. Whether that symbolism will actually translate into actual action doing, this is what I expect Putin's visit to Pyongyang would reveal. Because I cannot possibly imagine, and anyone who has been in the business of national affairs understand that when two heads of state meet, it's not to share a cup of tea or look at the missile. You need to see some sort of a conclusive evidence of the outcome. So there was no conclusive evidence after Kim visited Putin in the Far East. So I would expect something to come out now. And that would demonstrate, what is the future direction between Moscow and Pyongyang. But one thing is what is certain to me. The bromance there is certainly back on track. So Russia is not going to abandon North Korea in a couple of years' time.
Really complicate the situation.
Well, then we would have a different level of strategic geometry with Kim being in the middle.
That'll be the subject of Alexey's next talk when it comes to it. One more question in the back.
So there's two questions. One is that there's a rumor that actually Kim visited Beijing last month. I don't know whether you heard about that rumor or not. I can't verify that source at all. They said he actually secretly visited Beijing. I think while Yellen flight out and Blinken flight in, like that period, Kim actually secretly visit Beijing. And second question.
Who flew out?
When Yellen.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the second question is a little bit theoretical. I noticed from this topic that is like either friends with benefit, and you mentioned that the rocket looks a little bit like a phallic symbol, and there's also like Russia is kind of famous for their misogynistic discourse while Putin is giving his speech. So is there any kind of like unity there between these two countries on this misogynistic discourse?
You're referring to missiles as phallic symbols?
Well, rocket, like. I heard.
I don't know what kind of dirty talk they're using in terms of describing the systems that they're producing.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah. So, like, is there any kind of like feminist IR theory that we can see from this interaction between these two countries, especially in a military side?
All right. Well, it's a very interesting proposition. Certainly, in the military side, in my 25 years in defense-related research, I haven't noticed any feminist theories there. It's just the nature of defense-related research. However, one of the current trends that exists, and I strongly support, is promoting women in the business of security and defense. So that's the feminist angle that I can certainly see occurring in the field of defense and strategic studies, recognizing that it should be open and there should be equal opportunities for all genders and people with different orientations in this sense. Whether this is something that forms the agenda between the two countries, well, again, I can only reflect because I cannot base my research driven by rumors. So I can only reflect what's been confirmed in one way or another through sources that can be trusted. And as far as I can see, I don't think they discussed the feminine aspects or the misogynistic aspects, unless this is something that took place behind closed doors during dinners. But again, you need to be present there to concur or deny it. And in terms of what Kim is doing with his time when he's not thinking about Putin and writing him yet another letter, again, I'm not 100% sure, so I cannot concur or deny whether he traveled to Beijing or not, because again, that's slightly outside of my scope of research. It is possible. Well, certainly whenever he takes his train across the Russian border, everyone notices it. So I don't know whether there are actual photographic evidence that same train, because I doubt that he would fly, same train crossed the border with China. So that, to me, that would be a confirmation that he went there. Okay,
well, that brings us to our allotted time. So Alexey, thank you again for the presentation, for the detail, for some provocative comments, and Zara's opened the way for you to come back and talk again, should there be a change in the election in the US later in the year. But please join me in thanking Alexey.
Thank you.
Really interesting talk.